Hey guys, tonight we're going on a little trip. A journey back in time, to a place you think you know, but I promise you, you don't. Close your eyes for a second and imagine it, the smell of damp earth, a faint tang of wood smoke in the cold air, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance. The world is a whole lot quieter, a whole lot darker, and a whole lot more dangerous. You're trudging down a muddy road, your woolen clothes are scratchy and your stomach is rumbling a bit. You see a light in the distance and head toward it, thinking maybe there's some warmth, some food, some safety. But here's the thing about this journey, there's a pretty good chance you won't survive it. We're going to deconstruct the fairy tales and the movies, the sanitized versions of the past we've all been sold. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers to see the truth underneath. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our first stop is a place most people think they know, but they only know the glossy, romanticized version from bad movies and pop songs. We're talking about intimacy, about romance, about how people actually connected with one another in the Middle Ages. Forget the idea of a damsel in a flowing gown waiting for a knight to rescue her from a dragon. That's a lovely thought, but the reality was, well, it was a lot more complex, and in some ways, a lot more pragmatic. See, for most people, romance wasn't the fiery, passionate affair we think of today. It was a transaction. You, as a peasant girl, weren't falling head over heels for the dreamy guy from the next village. Your parents were probably arranging a marriage for you to the son of a neighboring farmer. Why? Because it made sense. It meant combining 2 plots of land, 2 families, 2 sets of labor to make survival just a little bit easier. Your job was to be fertile, to produce sons who could work the land and daughters who could be married off to secure more alliances. Love? That might come later, after a few children and a few years of shared hardship, or it might not. It was a luxury most people couldn't afford. It's a bit like buying a car because it has good mileage and low maintenance costs, not because you love the color. The relationship might be solid and dependable, but it's probably not going to be a blockbuster movie. The physical side of things was equally different. We have this idea that the Middle Ages were a time of prudishness and strict piety, but that's not the whole story. In some ways, it was more open than you'd think. Take, for example, the concept of courtly love. This was a whole system, a philosophy, really, where a knight would pledge his devotion to a married noblewoman. It was a kind of a grand, theatrical game. He would write her poems, perform great deeds in her honor, and essentially idolize her from afar. This wasn't about a physical relationship, at least not in the beginning. It was about refining the soul through noble suffering. The physical act was often considered less important than the emotional and spiritual bond. It was a very stylized, almost performative, way of expressing admiration and desire. This was the kind of romance you'd see in the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine, where poetry and art were just as important as politics and warfare. But again, this was for the tiny, tiny fraction of the population with enough leisure time and education to bother with it. You, as a peasant, were still just trying to grow enough turnips to make it through winter. But let's get a bit more earthy. Let's talk about the physical stuff. Because while courtly love was a thing for the elite, most people were just people. And they had needs. The church, of course, had some pretty strong opinions on the matter. They laid out very specific rules. You couldn't get it on during Lent, or Advent, or on Sundays, or on feast days. If you did the math, that left a surprisingly small window for activities. You could also get in trouble for certain positions, which were deemed unnatural. So, you had a lot of rules, a lot of guilt, and a lot of, well, let's just say a lot of workarounds. The idea was to procreate, not to have a good time. Any pleasure was seen as a dangerous side effect, a temptation to be resisted. This is a very mainstream historical fact that is often glossed over. The church was essentially a shadow government, dictating not just your spiritual life, but your most intimate moments. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit: there was a lot of folklore and superstition around love and sex. People would try all sorts of things to make someone fall in love with them. They'd use love potions made from strange ingredients, sometimes involving things like ground-up spiders or other, less than appetizing items. They would use magic spells and charms, all in an attempt to manipulate the most chaotic and unpredictable human emotion. Think of it as a medieval Tinder, but instead of swiping right, you're trying to slip a potion made of bat wings and rose petals into their mead. And historians still argue whether these practices were genuine attempts at magic or just elaborate social rituals meant to express desire in a culture that didn't have a lot of outlets for it. The concept of marriage itself was fluid. For a long time, the church didn't even require a formal ceremony. You could be considered married just by promising to be with someone and then, well, by consummating the relationship. It wasn't until much later that the church cracked down and made a formal, public ceremony a requirement. It's a fascinating look at how our modern idea of marriage, the white dress, the wedding cake, the whole shebang, is a relatively recent invention. Back then, it was more about a public declaration, a kind of handshake deal that everyone in the community knew about. So, when you think about love in the Middle Ages, don't think of it as a single, simple thing. It was a tapestry woven with a million different threads: the cold pragmatism of survival, the refined, almost spiritual devotion of courtly love, the rigid rules of the church, and the wild, chaotic folklore of the common people. It was a world where romance wasn't a given, but a thing to be earned, to be fought for, to be, well, sometimes it was just a way to make sure your farm didn't get absorbed by the guy next door. And that's a different kind of love, isn't it? One born not of passion, but of necessity. Alright, let's keep going. We've talked about romance, about how people thought about love and intimacy. Now, let's talk about a specific, very infamous part of that story, the chastity belt. You've seen them in movies, right? The big, clunky iron contraption, the dutiful knight locking up his lady love before heading off to war, the heavy key jangling on his chain mail. It's a powerful image, a symbol of control and paranoia. But here's the thing, it's almost completely, totally, and utterly wrong. The chastity belt, as a historical reality, is a myth. A fabrication. It's a bit like believing that knights rode around on fire-breathing dragons. It's a great story, but there's just no evidence for it. The belts you see in museums today? Almost all of them are from the 19th century, made as novelties or even for some, shall we say, more kinky purposes. They were often sold to tourists as authentic, medieval torture devices, feeding into a Victorian fascination with the barbarism of the past. The idea of the chastity belt perfectly fit the narrative of a brutal, unenlightened age. It was a juicy, dramatic story that people wanted to believe. This is a great example of a modern myth, a mainstream historical fact that is actually just a popular misconception. Now, why did this myth take hold so strongly? For one, it's a powerful metaphor. The image of a man locking up his wife's fidelity is a simple, visceral representation of male control and female subjugation. It speaks to anxieties about a woman's sexuality and her autonomy. It also makes for great comedy and drama. But historians have scoured the records, combed through inventories, and looked for evidence of these things being used in the Middle Ages, and nothing. Zero. Zilch. Nada. No mention in letters, no drawings in manuscripts, no records of blacksmiths crafting them. They simply didn't exist in the way we imagine them. Think about it logically for a second. An iron belt? Imagine the rust, the infections, the sheer discomfort. You'd have to wear this thing 24/7. How would you go to the bathroom? How would you maintain any kind of hygiene? The logistical nightmares alone would make it completely unworkable. A quick look at the design of these purported devices shows them to be utterly impractical for daily life. The materials and craftsmanship would also have been incredibly expensive, putting them far out of reach for all but the very wealthiest. Even then, no one with any sense would have tried to use one. They would have caused terrible injuries and disease, a much worse fate than, well, whatever infidelity they were meant to prevent. So what was the reality of a knight's wife when he rode off to the Crusades or to a distant war? She wasn't locked away. In fact, she was often given a huge amount of responsibility. A lord's wife would be in charge of the entire castle or manor. She would manage the household, oversee the servants, deal with tenants and land disputes, and generally keep the whole operation running smoothly. She was essentially the CEO of a small feudal kingdom. Her fidelity wasn't guaranteed by an iron belt, it was ensured by social pressure, family honor, and the very real dangers of having a child out of wedlock in a world with no DNA tests. A child born of an unknown father could throw an entire lineage and inheritance into chaos. This was a much more powerful deterrent than a rusty piece of iron. Now for a quirky tidbit, there was a form of physical restraint used, but it was very different and had a completely different purpose. Some societies, particularly in the later Middle Ages, used what were known as scold's bridles or branks. These were iron headpieces with a metal plate that would fit into a woman's mouth to prevent her from speaking. They were a form of public humiliation and punishment for women who were considered gossips or nags. It was a truly horrific device, but it was about controlling speech, not sexuality. It's a grim reminder of how women's autonomy was curtailed, but it's a very different thing from the mythical chastity belt. Historians still argue whether the scold's bridle was a widespread practice or a regional, and thankfully rare, one. The historical record is a bit muddy on just how often they were used, but we know for a fact they existed, unlike the chastity belt. The myth of the chastity belt is so persistent because it's a simple, easy-to-grasp story. It's a caricature of the past, a shorthand for the perceived barbarism of the Middle Ages. But the truth is, the past was far more nuanced. The control of women wasn't about a literal, physical lock and key. It was about social structures, economic necessity, and the pervasive power of the church and family. It was a form of control that was much more subtle and much more effective than a clumsy iron belt. It's a good lesson. Sometimes the most memorable stories are the ones that are the most fictional. We'll find a lot of those as we keep going on our journey. So, as we move on, let's leave the rusty iron contraptions behind. The real story of the Middle Ages is far more interesting than the myths we've been told. It's a story of complex social dynamics, of a different kind of love, and of the incredible strength and resilience of people in a world that was, in many ways, just as complicated as our own. You just have to look a little closer to see it. We've talked about romance, and we've debunked a pretty famous myth. Let's move on to something a little grimier. Something that I bet is already tickling your imagination with visions of grime and pestilence. I'm talking about hygiene. You've probably heard the old saw that medieval people were just, well, they were filthy. That they never bathed, that they reeked, and that's why all those old cartoons show a cloud of flies buzzing around them. It's an easy image to believe, isn't it? The Middle Ages as a time of dirt and squalor. But like so much of what we think we know, that's not the full story. In fact, it's a massive oversimplification. The truth is, medieval people were actually quite concerned with cleanliness, but their methods were different, and their definitions of clean didn't always align with ours. For a long time, particularly in the early Middle Ages, bathing was a common and even social activity. Public bathhouses, inherited from the Romans, were still a thing. You could go and relax, chat with your neighbors, and get clean all at the same time. This was a mainstream historical fact that is often forgotten. These bathhouses weren't just for the rich, they were for everyone. You could find them in towns and cities all over Europe. Think of them as a combination of a modern-day sauna, a community center, and a public pool. People would bathe, get a haircut, and probably catch up on all the local gossip. The church, in its early days, was a bit wary of them, viewing the communal nudity as a potential source of temptation, but the practice was too popular to stop. But things started to change, particularly after the Black Death. This is a crucial point, and a good example of how a catastrophic event can alter daily habits. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, people had no idea what caused it. They saw that it seemed to spread in crowded places. So what was a crowded place? A public bathhouse. Suddenly, the very idea of communal bathing became terrifying. People associated it with disease and death. They started to believe that opening the pores of your skin by washing would let the disease in. This led to a gradual decline in public bathing. It wasn't that people didn't want to be clean, it was that they were genuinely terrified of the consequences. They thought they were protecting themselves by staying out of the water. This is where we get the quirky tidbit that people often mistake for the entirety of medieval hygiene. Instead of full-body bathing, people started to focus on dry cleaning. They would use linen cloths to wipe down their bodies. They'd rub fragrant herbs and perfumes on themselves. The wealthy would have multiple layers of linen shirts that they could change regularly, with the inner layer absorbing the sweat and grime. This was a much more common practice than you might think. For them, cleanliness wasn't about being scrubbed raw with soap and water, it was about smelling pleasant and having clean clothes touching your skin. This is a very different way of thinking about hygiene than we have today. So, while the idea that they never bathed is a total myth, the frequency and method of bathing changed dramatically over time. You might still have taken a bath, but it was probably a private affair in a wooden tub in your own home, and it was a lot less frequent than you'd think. Maybe once a month for some, or just a few times a year for others. It was a huge undertaking. You had to heat up all that water, which took a lot of wood and a lot of labor. It wasn't a quick shower, it was a full-on production. And what about their teeth? We have this image of them having terrible teeth, but that's not always true either. They didn't have sugar in the way we do today, which is the main culprit for modern dental decay. They cleaned their teeth with rough cloths and abrasive powders made from things like crushed eggshells or burnt rosemary. They even used twigs from certain trees that acted as natural toothbrushes. So, while they didn't have the gleaming white smiles we see in commercials, their dental health was, in many ways, better than people in the 17th or 18th centuries, who had started to import a lot of sugar and were suffering the consequences. Historians still argue whether the decline of public bathhouses was purely due to the plague, or if other factors like religious pressure and economic shifts also played a role. It was probably a mix of all three. But the idea that they were just unthinkingly dirty is a modern caricature. They were people trying to survive and be comfortable in their own skin, and they had their own ideas about how to do that. They just didn't have running water, industrial-scale soap production, or the germ theory of disease. So, let's be a little more charitable with our long-ago ancestors, shall we? You'd be surprised at how resourceful they were. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, they had their own versions of all sorts of personal care products, just made from what they had on hand. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. We've talked about love and hygiene, the stuff of daily life. Now, let's talk about something that utterly shattered daily life. Something so catastrophic, so terrifying, that it fundamentally reshaped the world we've been exploring. I'm talking about the plague. The Black Death. You know the basics, right? It was a horrible disease that killed a lot of people. You probably have an image in your head of plague doctors in those spooky bird-like masks and everyone dropping dead in the streets. But the story of the plague is so much more than just death and disease. Its impact was so profound that it set the stage for the Renaissance and the modern world. The plague wasn't just a bad flu season. It was a societal reset button. When it first hit Europe in the mid-14th century, it killed an estimated 30 to 60% of the population. Just take a moment to really think about that number. Imagine half the people you know, your family, your friends, your neighbors, suddenly gone. The scale of this loss is almost impossible to comprehend. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact that is often simplified to just a lot of people died. It's one of the most significant population crises in human history, and its consequences rippled through every single part of society. Economically, it was a game changer. Before the plague, Europe was overpopulated. Land was scarce, and labor was cheap. Peasants were essentially tied to the land and had very little power. But after the plague, suddenly there was a massive labor shortage. With so few people to work the fields, the surviving peasants found themselves in a position of power for the first time. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. If their lord refused, they could simply pack up and go to the next village, where another lord would be desperate for their labor. This completely broke the feudal system. The old power structure, where the lord held all the cards, was gone forever. It's a fascinating example of supply and demand on a truly macabre scale. Politically, this led to a lot of turmoil. The old elites weren't happy about losing their power and their cheap labor. They tried to pass laws to freeze wages and prevent peasants from leaving their lands, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave. This led to peasant revolts across Europe, like the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. These weren't just random acts of violence, they were a direct result of the new economic reality created by the plague. People had a taste of freedom and opportunity, and they weren't going to give it up easily. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed a way of life. Now for a quirky tidbit, the plague doctors in those famous masks. Those masks weren't a common sight during the main plague outbreaks of the 14th century. They became more common in the 17th century, a few hundred years later. The bird-like beak was filled with fragrant herbs and spices, which doctors believed would ward off the bad air or miasma that they thought caused the disease. The truth is, it probably offered little protection against the actual fleas and rats that carried the plague, but it made for a very intimidating, and now very famous, costume. The real story of medieval medicine during the plague was much simpler and much more desperate: bleedings, prayers, and a lot of wishful thinking. The Black Death also had a massive impact on religion and culture. People saw the world collapsing around them. They prayed, they went to church, but still, millions died. This led to a crisis of faith. Why would God allow this to happen? Was it punishment for humanity's sins? Or was the church itself a failure? This questioning of authority, both religious and secular, laid the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation a few centuries later. Art and literature also became much darker and more preoccupied with death. The Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death, became a popular artistic theme, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life, kings, popes, peasants, to the grave. It was a powerful reminder that death was the great equalizer, and no one was safe. Historians still argue whether the plague was the sole reason for the collapse of feudalism and the rise of the modern world, or if other long-term trends were already in motion. It's a classic chicken and egg debate. Did the plague accelerate a change that was already happening, or did it create the change out of nowhere? Most scholars today would say it was a powerful accelerator. It took existing tensions and problems and poured gasoline on them, forcing a change that might have otherwise taken centuries. So, the next time you think of the plague, don't just think of the death, think of the birth. The birth of a new world, a new way of thinking, and a new sense of possibility for the survivors. Alright, let's step away from the plague and its shadows for a bit and turn our attention to something a lot more, well, shiny. The knight in shining armor. It's an image we all know, the brave, noble warrior, clad in gleaming plate mail, riding a magnificent horse, rescuing the damsel in distress. The embodiment of chivalry, honor, and courage. It's the very essence of the Middle Ages in our collective imagination. But, you know what's coming, don't you? The reality was, as usual, a whole lot less romantic and a lot more complicated. First, let's talk about that armor. The iconic full-plate armor that you see in movies and video games, the stuff that really shines, wasn't a thing for most of the Middle Ages. That style of armor, the full suit of articulated metal, only became common in the 15th century, a little late in the game. For most of the period we're talking about, knights wore chain mail, a kind of shirt made of thousands of tiny interlocking metal rings. It was heavy, hot, and didn't offer much protection against a good, solid blow from a mace or a warhammer. It was more about deflecting a sword slash than stopping a blunt force trauma. So, that gleaming, polished armor? It was a bit of a special occasion outfit, not your everyday work gear. And let's be honest, that work was not always as noble as the stories would have you believe. Chivalry, as a concept, was a beautiful idea. It was a code of conduct that encouraged knights to be brave, just, and courteous. A mainstream historical fact is that this code was, in practice, more of an ideal to strive for than a strict set of rules that were always followed. Knights were just as likely to be brutal, greedy, and violent as they were to be honorable. They weren't a police force, they were the military arm of the land-owning elite. Their primary job wasn't to rescue people, it was to fight for their lord, defend their lord's land, and to, expand their lord's land, often through conquest and violence against common people. A good example of this is the concept of a ransom. When a knight captured another knight in battle, he didn't just kill him. He took him prisoner and held him for ransom. This was a crucial part of the feudal economy. The captured knight's family would have to pay a large sum to get him back. This created a kind of gentleman's agreement among the nobility: we won't kill each other, because there's more money to be made by taking each other prisoner. This wasn't about chivalry, it was about profit. It was a very pragmatic, and frankly, a bit cynical, way of making a living. It's a lot less noble when you think of it as a business transaction, isn't it? Now for a quirky tidbit, what did a knight do when he wasn't fighting? A lot of them spent their time bored. Being a knight was a profession, but warfare wasn't a constant state of being. So, in between conflicts, they would practice their skills in tournaments. And these tournaments were brutal. They weren't the jousting matches with the fancy blunted lances we see in movies. Early tournaments were often full-scale melees, where dozens of knights would fight in a kind of free-for-all, using real weapons. People were seriously injured, and sometimes even killed. It was a spectacle, a way for knights to show off their skills, and a way for them to make a little extra cash, as they could take the horses and armor of the knights they defeated. It was much more like a medieval cage match than a sporting event. This brings us to a scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the concept of chivalry was a genuine reflection of knightly behavior, or if it was a kind of propaganda, a way for the nobility to justify their often brutal position at the top of the social hierarchy. Was it a code that guided their actions, or a set of ideals that they aspired to, but rarely achieved? Most scholars today would say it was a bit of both. It was a cultural ideal that influenced literature and art, but the reality on the ground was often much more self-serving and violent. A knight's loyalty was to his lord, his family, and his own self-interest, in that order. The damsel in distress was probably not on the priority list. So, the next time you see a knight in a movie, remember the truth underneath the shiny armor. He was a professional soldier, probably a bit grimy, and definitely not as noble as the stories say. He was a product of his time, a part of a very specific social and economic system that valued strength and loyalty above all else. He was a warrior, but he was also a businessman, a landowner, and a very fallible human being, just like the rest of us. It's a bit less magical, I know, but it's a lot more real. Let's shift our focus from the knight in his not-so-shiny armor to the people who made his world possible, the peasants. The word peasant itself often conjures up images of a simple, brutish person in rags, toiling endlessly in the mud with a pitchfork, living a short, miserable life. It's a powerful stereotype, but it's just that, a stereotype. The reality of peasant life was far more complex, and in some ways, far more resourceful than we give them credit for. First and foremost, a peasant wasn't just a farmer. The medieval village was a bustling, interconnected community filled with specialists. You had your blacksmith, your miller, your baker, your weaver, and your carpenter. Every single one of these roles was crucial to the survival of the community. So, a mainstream historical fact is that the medieval village was a vibrant economic unit, not just a collection of huts for dirt-poor farmers. The peasants were the backbone of the entire society, producing not just food but also the goods and services that everyone, from the lowliest serf to the highest lord, depended on. Now, let's talk about that endless toil. Yes, peasant life was hard. There's no getting around that. The work was physically demanding and the hours were long, especially during planting and harvesting seasons. But they also had a surprising amount of time off. The medieval calendar was packed with feast days, saints' days, and religious holidays. The church, in its own way, provided a lot of downtime. Think of it as a kind of built-in vacation schedule. Historians still argue exactly how many days they had off, but estimates suggest it could be as many as 80 or 90 days a year, not including Sundays. That's a lot of time for festivals, parties, and just, well, not working. This is a quirky tidbit that completely upends the image of the peasant as a non-stop laborer. They worked hard when they had to, but they also knew how to celebrate. And while their lives were tough, their communities were often quite tight-knit. The village was a social hub. People helped each other out. They celebrated together, mourned together, and relied on each other for everything. The idea of the individual was less important than the community. Your life was completely intertwined with your neighbors. If your barn burned down, the whole village would pitch in to help you rebuild it. This was a system of mutual support that was far more effective than any government social program. It was born of necessity, but it created a powerful sense of belonging. The idea of the brutish peasant is also a massive misnomer. They were often highly skilled and knowledgeable. They knew the land, they knew the weather, and they knew how to make things with their hands. They had a kind of wisdom that was passed down through generations, a practical knowledge that was essential for survival. This is a very different image from the uneducated, ignorant buffoon we often see in modern portrayals. They might not have been able to read and write, but they were not stupid. They were experts in their own field, and their skills were what kept the entire society from collapsing. Historians still argue about the exact nature of the relationship between peasants and their lords. Was it a form of slavery? Or was it a more complex, almost contractual relationship? Most scholars today would say it was somewhere in the middle. The peasant was bound to the land, but the lord also had obligations to protect the peasant and to allow them access to resources like the village mill and the common pasture. It was a symbiotic, if unequal, relationship. The lord needed the peasant's labor, and the peasant needed the lord's protection. So, let's leave behind the simplistic image of the poor, miserable peasant. The reality was a person of incredible resilience and skill, a vital part of a complex community, who worked hard but also knew how to celebrate. They were the ones who kept the lights on, the food on the table, and the society moving forward. You might not have been a knight, but as a peasant, you were at the very heart of the medieval world. And that's a pretty important place to be. You've been a peasant, you've been a knight, now let's talk about where they all lived. The castle. The word itself brings up images of grandeur, of thick stone walls, towering battlements, and kings and queens living in luxurious comfort. The castle, in our imagination, is the ultimate medieval power fantasy. But the reality of living in a medieval castle was a far cry from the fairy tales. It was cold, it was damp, and it was a logistical nightmare. First, let's talk about the temperature. Castles were built for defense, not for comfort. They were essentially big stone boxes. The walls were thick and made of solid rock, which meant they held onto the cold and the dampness like a sponge. Fireplaces, a mainstream historical fact, were a later addition and a luxury. Even when a castle had a fireplace, it was notoriously inefficient. The heat would go straight up the chimney, leaving the rest of the room as chilly as a crypt. So, your idea of a cozy evening by the fire? It was probably more like huddling in a corner in multiple layers of wool, with a draft whistling through the window slits and making your toes go numb. You'd probably sleep under a pile of furs, and even then, you'd be a little bit cold. And the smells, oh, the smells. The glamorized view of a castle often forgets the sheer amount of waste produced by hundreds of people and their animals living in one place. Sanitation was, to put it mildly, a work in progress. People used guardrobes, which were essentially vertical chutes in the wall that emptied directly into the moat or a cesspit below. This was the castle's version of a toilet, and while it was a clever bit of engineering for its time, it didn't exactly make the area pleasant. You had the constant stench of human waste, a lot of animal dung from the stables, and the general aromas of cooking and unwashed bodies all mingling together. It wasn't a place of perfumes and fresh flowers, it was a place of powerful, earthy, and often unpleasant odors. Now for a quirky tidbit, those moats. They weren't just a line of defense. They were also a kind of medieval dump. People threw their garbage, their animal carcasses, and their waste into the moat, believing that the stagnant, stinking water would provide an extra layer of protection against invading armies. The idea was that the attackers wouldn't want to wade through the horrible mess. And you know what? It probably worked. The smell alone would have been a significant deterrent. It's a great example of how medieval people used everything, even their own waste, for a practical purpose. The whole concept of the castle as a single, glorious home is also a bit of a myth. Castles were not just residences, they were military fortresses, administrative centers, and social hubs. The Great Hall was the main room, where the lord would hold court, where everyone would eat together, and where much of the daily life happened. This was a place of constant activity and noise. You didn't have separate dining rooms and living rooms and bedrooms in the modern sense. You might have a private chamber for the lord and lady, but for most people, privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. You slept in the great hall, surrounded by dozens of other people, with their snores and their body heat and their, well, all the other stuff that comes with living in a crowded space. Historians still argue whether the castle was a symbol of strength and security, or if it was also a sign of a very unstable world. A world where you needed to literally wall yourself off from your neighbors to feel safe. Was the castle a testament to human engineering and ingenuity, or was it a grim reminder of a society built on fear and violence? Most scholars would say it was both. It was a place of immense power and a place of immense vulnerability. It was a fortress against the outside world, but a very cold, smelly, and uncomfortable home on the inside. So, the next time you think of a castle, maybe imagine pulling on an extra wool sock and hoping the wind doesn't blow in the wrong direction. What they wore, and who they were. Now let's get into what happened when things went wrong with the human body. When you got sick, or broke a bone, or had some other kind of ailment. Our modern imagination often paints a picture of medieval medicine as nothing but leeches, superstition, and barbers performing botched amputations. And while some of that is true, it's far from the whole story. Medieval medicine was, in many ways, surprisingly advanced, and in other ways, hilariously and tragically misguided. First, let's establish a mainstream historical fact: medieval doctors were not a bunch of quacks. They were often highly educated and well-versed in the medical theories of their time, which were largely based on the works of ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Galen and Hippocrates. The dominant theory was the concept of the four humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. The idea was that a person was healthy when these humours were in perfect balance. An illness was simply a sign that one of them was out of whack. So, a fever might be a sign of too much blood, and the treatment would be to remove some of that blood. This is where the infamous practice of bloodletting comes in. They would use leeches or cut a vein to let out what they believed was the excess humor. It sounds barbaric to us, but to them, it was a perfectly logical and scientific approach based on the best knowledge they had. Now, let's talk about surgery. Yes, barbers did perform surgery, and they were often quite good at it. The barber surgeons were a lower class of medical practitioner, but they were often the ones on the front lines, dealing with everything from tooth extractions to setting broken bones. And when it came to things like amputations, they were surprisingly effective. They didn't have anesthesia, of course, other than a strong drink, and they didn't have germ theory. So, the patient's survival often depended on a combination of luck and the surgeon's speed. But they knew how to stitch up a wound and cauterize it to stop the bleeding. The problem wasn't the skill of the surgeon, it was the lack of understanding about what caused infections. They didn't know that dirty tools or unwashed hands could kill a person just as surely as the injury itself. This leads to a quirky tidbit about medieval medical practices. While the educated doctors were busy with their humours and their Latin texts, the common people often relied on a mix of folk remedies, herbal lore, and a lot of prayer. They would use poultices made from specific herbs, often with some kind of bizarre ingredient mixed in for good measure. A common remedy for a wound might be a paste made of mouldy bread and spider webs. Why? Because it was what was available, and sometimes, with a bit of luck, it might have worked. Interestingly, the mouldy bread part of that remedy actually contained a natural form of penicillin, a fact they couldn't have possibly known. So, some of their folk remedies were effective for reasons they couldn't explain. And historians still argue whether the church was a help or a hindrance to medical advancement. On one hand, monasteries were often centers of learning and places where ancient medical texts were preserved and studied. Monks were often skilled herbalists and would provide care for the sick in their communities. On the other hand, the church's dogma often discouraged human dissection, which severely limited doctors' understanding of anatomy. The idea was that the body was sacred and shouldn't be tampered with. This conflict between faith and science is a recurring theme in the Middle Ages, and medicine was right at the center of it. So, when you think of medieval medicine, don't just think of the weird stuff. Think of a world where doctors were trying their best with the tools and knowledge they had. A world where a combination of academic theory, practical surgical skills, and a healthy dose of folk wisdom all came together in a kind of messy, desperate attempt to keep people alive. It was a world that was both surprisingly smart and shockingly ignorant, all at the same time. And it was a world where a broken bone or a bad cough could easily be a death sentence, no matter how good the doctor was. From medicine, let's move on to the stuff that fueled it all, food. The medieval diet. When you think of medieval food, what comes to mind? Probably a giant roasted boar at a lavish feast, with a knight tearing off a piece with his bare hands. Or maybe some kind of soggy gruel for the peasants. As with everything else, the reality was a mix of both, and a lot more in between. The medieval diet was largely determined by your social class, the seasons, and the strict rules of the church. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, the diet was simple but surprisingly varied. A mainstream historical fact is that their diet was heavily based on cereals and legumes. They ate a lot of bread, often a coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley. They also ate pottage, which was a kind of thick stew made from vegetables like peas, beans, and onions, with some grain thrown in for good measure. This was their staple, their daily fuel. It was a remarkably nutritious meal, full of fiber and protein. They also grew their own vegetables in small kitchen gardens and foraged for things like berries and nuts in the local forests. Meat was a rare luxury, saved for special occasions or religious holidays. They might keep a pig or a few chickens, but these were often seen as a form of liquid savings, to be sold in times of hardship. So, the image of the peasant as a meat-eater is largely a myth. Their diet was overwhelmingly vegetarian, by necessity. Now, for the other end of the social spectrum, the nobility and the wealthy. Their diet was a completely different story. It was a show of power and wealth. Their feasts, a quirky tidbit, were not just about eating, they were a form of performance. A noble dinner would have multiple courses, each one more elaborate than the last. You might have roasted meats, pies filled with exotic spices, and intricate subtleties, which were sculptures made from things like sugar paste or marzipan. They would serve things like peacocks with their feathers reattached, or pies with live birds that would fly out when the crust was cut. This was all about spectacle, a way for the host to show off their wealth and their connections. They didn't use forks, a fact that is often brought up, but they did use knives and spoons, and they often ate from a shared trencher, which was a thick slice of stale bread that served as a plate and was either eaten at the end or given to the poor. The church played a huge role in what everyone ate. There were a surprising number of fast days throughout the year, Lent, Advent, Fridays, and so on, when people were forbidden from eating meat. This led to a huge demand for fish. For the wealthy, this meant things like salmon and eels, which were a luxury. For the poor, it meant salted cod or herring. The church's rules basically dictated the entire rhythm of the culinary year. Historians still argue about the quality of the medieval diet and its impact on health. Some scholars believe that the lower classes, despite their lack of meat, were actually quite healthy, as their diet was high in fiber and low in sugar. Others argue that they suffered from nutritional deficiencies due to a lack of variety and an over-reliance on a few staple crops. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. Their health depended on a lot of things: the quality of the soil, the success of the harvest, and whether they lived in a town or the countryside. A peasant in a good year was probably healthier than a noble who suffered from the effects of gout and a diet of too much rich food. So, when you think of medieval food, don't just think of the extremes. Think of a world where what you ate was a direct reflection of who you were, where meat was a status symbol, and where the most common meal was a bowl of thick, nourishing stew. It was a world that, in many ways, was far more connected to the land and the seasons than our own. We've journeyed through the lives of peasants and knights, peered into castles, and even tasted their food. Now, let's talk about the big picture, a phrase you've heard countless times, the Dark Ages. This is perhaps one of the most persistent and misleading labels in all of history. The term Dark Ages implies a period of ignorance, violence, and intellectual stagnation that followed the fall of the Roman Empire. It paints a picture of 1,000 years where nothing good happened, where Europe was a cultural wasteland. But let me tell you, that's just not true. The term is a massive misnomer, and we need to put it to rest. The idea of the Dark Ages is a later invention, a product of the Renaissance humanists who looked back on the Roman and Greek civilizations with awe and saw their own time as a rebirth of that classical glory. In contrast, they labeled the period in between as dark because they felt it lacked the art, literature, and philosophy of the classical world. It was a kind of a marketing campaign for their own time, a way to make themselves look even better. But what they failed to see, or chose to ignore, was the incredible amount of innovation and intellectual activity that was happening. A mainstream historical fact is that this period saw the foundation of the first universities, the invention of the printing press, which, while perfected later, had its roots in this era, and a huge boom in agricultural technology. Think about it, the very foundation of the modern university system, the idea of a structured curriculum, different faculties, and the pursuit of knowledge, was a medieval invention. Scholars in places like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna were tackling complex subjects like philosophy, theology, and law. They were engaged in intense intellectual debates that shaped Western thought for centuries to come. This was hardly a time of intellectual darkness. Now for a quirky tidbit, one of the biggest drivers of intellectual thought was not just a pursuit of pure knowledge, but a desire to understand the world through a theological lens. Scholasticism, a dominant school of thought, was all about using reason and logic to understand and support Christian doctrine. It might sound a little restrictive to us today, but it was an incredibly rigorous intellectual exercise. Think of it like a medieval version of a highly focused PhD program, but with God at the center of every equation. They weren't just praying and hoping for the best, they were building intricate logical arguments and philosophical frameworks. And what about the technology? The Middle Ages saw the invention of things we now take for granted. Eyeglasses, for instance, were a medieval invention. So were the mechanical clock, the compass, and the windmill. These were revolutionary technologies that fundamentally changed the way people lived and worked. The windmill, in particular, was a huge deal, as it provided a source of power that wasn't reliant on human or animal labor. It was a kind of green energy for the medieval world. So, the idea that nothing was happening on the technological front is just completely wrong. Historians still argue about the best way to categorize this long stretch of time. Some prefer the term Middle Ages or medieval period, while others have tried to break it down into smaller, more manageable chunks like the early, high, and late Middle Ages. What they all agree on, however, is that the term Dark Ages is outdated and inaccurate. It's a label that tells us more about the biases of the people who coined it than it does about the actual period itself. So, let's leave the Dark Ages in the dustbin of history where it belongs. Let's think of the Middle Ages instead as a time of immense change, of intellectual curiosity, and of the slow but steady building of the world that would eventually become our own. It was a time of growth, not decline. We've put the Dark Ages to bed, so let's move on to something a little more magical. Or, at least, something that a lot of people thought was magical: witchcraft and superstition. When you think of medieval superstition, you probably imagine witch hunts, people being burned at the stake, and a world where every strange event was blamed on some kind of dark magic. And while the fear of witchcraft was very real, and the persecution was brutal, the history of it is far more nuanced and, in some ways, much more recent than you might think. First, a mainstream historical fact: the massive, widespread witch hunts that we associate with the Middle Ages actually happened much later, in the late 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. This was well after the medieval period had ended. The Middle Ages certainly had its share of superstition and accusations of magic, but it wasn't the kind of industrial-scale persecution that would later grip Europe. In the medieval period, the Church's stance was often that magic was either a delusion or the work of the devil, and they tended to view it as a heretical act. They weren't hunting down old women in the woods and accusing them of flying on broomsticks. That imagery is a product of a later, much more paranoid era. Now, let's talk about the belief in magic itself. It wasn't always seen as a dark, evil force. For many people, a quirky tidbit is that magic was a part of everyday life. It was a way of explaining the unexplainable and a way of trying to control an uncontrollable world. People would use charms to protect their crops from blight, or hang a horseshoe over their door for good luck. This was often seen as white magic or folk magic, and it was a completely different thing from the black magic that the Church was so worried about. It was a kind of a practical spirituality, a way of interacting with a world that was full of unseen forces. The fear of witchcraft, when it did emerge, was fueled by a number of factors. The Church, in its desire to consolidate power, began to crack down on any form of religious dissent or non-sanctioned spiritual practice. The rise of printed books and the spread of new ideas about the devil and demonic pacts also played a huge role. It created a kind of moral panic, where people began to see the devil everywhere, and the devil's minions were believed to be witches. This led to the creation of the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, in 1487, which was a kind of guidebook for hunting witches. It was a horrific and influential book that codified the persecution and became a key text for the later witch hunts. And here's a crucial scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the witch hunts were a result of a genuine belief in witchcraft, or if they were a way of controlling and subjugating women, a kind of social cleansing. Many of the people accused of witchcraft were older, single women who lived on the fringes of society. They were easy targets, and their deaths served as a powerful warning to others. It's a debate that touches on issues of gender, power, and the nature of social hysteria. The truth, as is often the case, is probably a combination of both, a genuine fear of magic that was exploited for social and political ends. So, when you think of medieval superstition, don't think of the roaring fires and the terrified women of later centuries. Think of a world that was full of folk remedies and lucky charms, a world that was trying to make sense of itself in the only way it knew how. It was a world that was a lot more complex and a lot less black and white than our modern imagination allows. Witches and magic, and the fear they inspired. Now, let's get into what happened when those fears became reality, at least in the eyes of the law. Let's talk about medieval law and justice. You probably have an image in your head of a brutal, unforgiving system, of torture chambers, public executions, and a lord's word being the final authority. And while there was plenty of brutality, the system was a lot more complex, and in some ways, surprisingly logical for its time. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval justice system was not a single, unified thing. It was a patchwork of different laws and courts, with a lot of overlap. You had royal courts for major crimes, manor courts for local disputes, and church courts for moral and religious offenses. A person accused of a crime might have to navigate all three, depending on who they were and what they were accused of. This system was often inefficient and prone to corruption, but it also meant that a person might have multiple avenues for appeal. Now, about those public executions and punishments. Yes, they were a very real part of medieval life. A quirky tidbit is that they were not just about punishment, they were also a form of public spectacle and entertainment. People would gather to watch a hanging or a beheading, and it was often a major social event. This sounds incredibly grim to us, but it served a purpose. It was a way for the authorities to demonstrate their power and to instill a healthy fear of the law in the general population. It was a kind of a public theater of justice, a warning to anyone who might be tempted to break the rules. But what about guilt and innocence? How did they figure that out? They didn't have fingerprints or DNA evidence. For a long time, they relied on what was called trial by ordeal. The idea was that God would intervene to reveal the truth. For example, a person might have to hold a hot iron or plunge their hand into boiling water. If their hand healed quickly, they were innocent. If not, they were guilty. It sounds completely insane to us, but to them, it made perfect sense. It was a leap of faith, a way of putting the decision in the hands of a higher power. This is a crucial point, because it shows how deeply religion was woven into the fabric of daily life, even in the courtroom. The Church, in a surprising turn, actually helped to move the legal system toward a more modern approach. In the 13th century, a decree by the Pope banned clergy from participating in trials by ordeal. This forced the courts to find new ways of determining guilt, which led to the slow development of trial by jury and the use of witnesses. This is a good example of how the Church, for all its flaws, could sometimes push society toward a more rational and humane path. Historians still argue whether the medieval legal system was more about control and power than it was about justice. Was it a system designed to protect the powerful and punish the weak? Or was it a genuine, if flawed, attempt to create a sense of order in a violent and chaotic world? Most scholars would agree that it was a bit of both. The law was often used as a tool by the powerful to enforce their will, but it also provided a framework for resolving disputes and maintaining a fragile peace. So, the next time you think of a medieval courtroom, don't just think of the torture. Think of a world trying to figure out how to be fair, a world where the line between a legal procedure and a religious ritual was often blurred, and a world where justice was just as likely to come from a leap of faith as it was from a rational argument. Law and justice, but let's take a moment to look at the people who were often at the mercy of those systems, and who were largely absent from our previous discussions: women. The role of women in the Middle Ages is often a source of great misconception. We tend to see them in two extremes, either the helpless damsel in distress, or the pious, demure nun. The reality, of course, was much more diverse and, in some cases, surprisingly powerful. A mainstream historical fact is that a woman's life was largely dictated by her social class. For a noblewoman, her life was a political and economic asset. Her marriage was a transaction, an alliance between two powerful families. Her job was to produce an heir, and to manage the affairs of the household and the estate in her husband's absence. She wasn't just a decoration, she was the CEO of a small feudal kingdom. She had to be a skilled administrator, a leader of her servants, and a competent manager of resources. Think of women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a powerful political force in her own right, ruling vast territories and leading armies. These were not damsels in distress. For peasant women, life was a bit different, but no less essential. She worked side by side with her husband in the fields, often performing the same back-breaking labor. She was also responsible for the home, for raising the children, and for a lot of the household production, like spinning wool into thread or brewing ale. A quirky tidbit is that in many medieval towns, women were a dominant force in the brewing industry. The alewife was a common sight, running her own business, and contributing to the family income. They were entrepreneurs in their own right, a far cry from the image of the submissive, silent wife. The church also offered women a different kind of power. For those who didn't want to get married, or who were widowed, the convent was a place of refuge and a place of learning. Women in convents often had access to an education that was completely unavailable to their secular counterparts. They could read, write, and study. Some abbesses, the female heads of convents, were incredibly powerful figures, managing large estates, and having a significant influence in both religious and political matters. A woman like Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess, was a visionary, a composer, and a philosopher, a true Renaissance woman a few centuries before the Renaissance even started. But let's not pretend it was all sunshine and roses. Women were legally considered the property of their fathers or husbands. Their rights were limited, and their bodies were often seen as a source of sin and temptation. The fear of witchcraft, which we've already touched on, was a very real danger for women who lived on the fringes of society or who simply didn't conform to the accepted norms. This leads us to a scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the medieval period was a time of greater or lesser freedom for women compared to the periods that followed. In some ways, a woman in the Middle Ages had more opportunities for economic independence and social influence than a woman in the 19th century, a time that we often think of as more enlightened. It's a complex picture, and it's a reminder that history isn't a linear progression toward greater freedom. It's a series of messy, complicated steps forward and back. So, when you think of medieval women, don't just think of the extremes. Think of a world full of Eleanor of Aquitaines and alewives and abbesses, a world where women were not just passive objects, but active participants in the business of surviving and thriving. The daily lives and roles of women. Now, let's talk about something that was often denied to them, and to most of the population for that matter: education. Our common view of the Middle Ages is that it was a time of widespread illiteracy, a world where only monks and a handful of wealthy elites could read and write. And while it's true that literacy rates were nowhere near what they are today, the reality was much more varied and, in some ways, quite surprising. A mainstream historical fact is that education in the Middle Ages was not a one-size-fits-all system. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants and the lower classes, formal education was simply not a thing. Their education was practical. They learned their trade from their parents or a local craftsman. A peasant boy learned how to plough a field, and a girl learned how to spin and weave. This was a kind of a vocational education, a hands-on learning that was essential for survival. It wasn't about reading books, it was about learning the skills you needed to live. But for those who did get an education, it was often a rigorous and demanding process. The church was the primary engine of education, and monasteries and cathedrals were the main centers of learning. Monks and priests were taught to read and write in Latin, the language of the church and of scholarship. They spent their days copying manuscripts, studying theology, and engaging in intellectual debates. This was a whole different world, a world of books and ideas that was largely separate from the world of daily life. Now for a quirky tidbit: while Latin was the language of the elite, the common people spoke in their own local dialects, which would eventually evolve into the modern languages we speak today. There was a growing body of literature being written in these vernacular languages, from epic poems to romantic stories. So, a person might not be able to read the Bible in Latin, but they could listen to a storyteller recite a tale of King Arthur in their own tongue. This was a different kind of literacy, a kind of cultural literacy that was passed down through stories and songs, not through books. It was a shared tradition that kept the culture alive, even among those who couldn't read. And what about the universities? We've already touched on them, but it's worth reiterating: the medieval university was a place of incredible intellectual ferment. Students would travel from all over Europe to attend lectures, and the curriculum was challenging. They would study the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and then move on to the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This was a serious education, one that was designed to train the mind and to prepare students for a career in the church or the law. Historians still argue about the exact literacy rates in the Middle Ages. Was it a complete anomaly for a common person to be able to read, or was it more common than we think? The evidence is often spotty, but most scholars today believe that the ability to read was more widespread than the ability to write, and that literacy, especially among merchants and tradesmen, was slowly but steadily on the rise. After all, if you were a merchant, you needed to be able to keep records and count money, and that required a basic level of reading and writing. So, the picture is not one of a complete darkness, but of a society with pockets of brilliant light, slowly spreading into the shadows. So, when you think of medieval education, don't just think of the ignorant masses. Think of a world where education was both a practical necessity and a spiritual pursuit, a world where learning was a privilege for the few, but where stories and ideas were shared by all. We've explored so much of the medieval world, from its intimacy to its education, from its food to its justice. Now, for our final chapter, let's turn to one of the biggest, most complex, and most misunderstood events of the era, the Crusades. You probably have an image in your head of a holy war, of fanatical knights charging into battle against a faceless enemy, all in the name of God. And while there was certainly a religious fervor, the reality of the Crusades was a tangled mess of religion, politics, and raw, naked greed. A mainstream historical fact is that the Crusades were not just a single event, they were a series of military campaigns that spanned nearly 200 years. They were called by the Pope to reclaim the Holy Land, specifically Jerusalem, from Muslim rule. But the motivations for joining a crusade were far more complicated than a simple desire to save souls. For the Pope, it was a way of consolidating power, of uniting the fractious kingdoms of Europe under a single, holy banner. For the kings and princes, it was an opportunity for territorial expansion, for gaining wealth and prestige. And for the younger sons of noble families, a quirky tidbit is that it was a way of carving out a new life for themselves. With primogeniture being the rule, where the eldest son inherited everything, the younger sons often had no land and no prospects. A crusade was a chance to go to a new land and, with a bit of luck, to conquer a title and a fortune of their own. The Crusades were a military endeavor, yes, but they were also a kind of a pilgrimage. The idea was that by going on this long, arduous journey, and by fighting in a holy war, you could have all your sins forgiven. This was a powerful incentive for a person who was worried about the fate of their soul in a world full of disease and sudden death. It was a kind of an ultimate get-out-of-hell-free card. But the reality of the Crusades was far from the idealized version in our heads. The knights weren't always honorable, and the battles weren't always glorious. The Crusades were often marked by incredible violence, not just against their Muslim opponents, but also against Jewish communities in Europe and even against other Christians. The Fourth Crusade, for instance, ended up sacking the Christian city of Constantinople, a move that permanently crippled the Byzantine Empire and had nothing to do with retaking Jerusalem. This is a stark reminder that the Crusades were often driven by political and economic self-interest, not just religious piety. Historians still argue about the ultimate legacy of the Crusades. Did they open up trade routes and lead to the exchange of ideas and technology between East and West? Or did they poison the relationship between the Christian and Muslim worlds for centuries to come? Most scholars would agree that it was a bit of both. The Crusades certainly led to an increase in trade and a new fascination with the exotic goods and spices of the East, but they also left a legacy of deep-seated animosity and misunderstanding that, in some ways, still echoes today. It's a powerful lesson that even events that are framed in the name of a holy cause are often driven by the basest of human motivations. And with that, our journey comes to an end. We've walked through the mud and the grime, we've seen the beauty and the brutality, we've deconstructed the myths and uncovered the reality. The Middle Ages were not a time of darkness, but a time of change. A time of superstition and science. A time of brutality and beauty. It was a world that was, in its own way, as complex and as human as our own. It's a world that's always waiting for us to come back and look at it a little closer. Now, as our journey concludes, let's take a moment to fade the imagery. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer is now just a soft hum in the distance, the smell of the wood smoke is now just a faint whisper on the air, and the mud on the road is now just a faint memory on your shoes. Let go of the images, let go of the stories, and let your mind drift back to the present. The world is quiet now, the air is still, you're safe, you're warm, and you're ready to rest. Just close your eyes, and let the silence take over. Sweet dreams, my friend.